I'm Ron Strickland. This webcast is one of a series in which I'm presenting some brief lectures and commentaries on topics from the courses I teach in literature and cultural studies. This particular installment is the fifth in a series on Joseph Conrad's novel, Heart of Darkness. In the earlier videos, I've situated Conrad's work in relation to the socio-political and cultural context of his time, the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. And I've looked at some specific scenes from the first part of the novel. Here I'll be focusing on the last part of the novel, where Conrad's protagonist, Charlie Marlow, finally travels up the Congo River to the inner station to meet the much talked about Mr. Kurtz. As Marlow describes his voyage upriver, he gets deeper and deeper into philosophical reflections. He says, "It was the stillness of an implacable force brooding over an inscrutable intention. It looked at you with a vengeful aspect. I got used to it afterwards. I did not see it anymore. I had no time. I had to keep guessing at the channel. I had to discern, mostly by inspiration, the signs of hidden banks. I watched for sunken stones. I was learning to clap my teeth smartly before my heart flew out, when I shaved by a fluke some infernal sly old snag that would have ripped the life out of the tin-pot steamboat and drowned all the pilgrims. When you have to attend to things of that sort, to the mere incidents of the surface, the reality, I tell you, fades. The inner truth is hidden, luckily. But I felt it all the same. I felt often its mysterious stillness watching me at my monkey tricks, just as it watches you fellows performing on your respective tightropes for, what is it, half a crown a tumble? So Marlow makes a connection between the compromises that he was making on this voyage and the kinds of compromises that we all make in our daily lives, at our jobs. One of Marlow's friends takes offense at this. In Marlow's example of rope dancing for compromising one's principles, I see an allusion to Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Gulliver describes the Lilliputian political practice of rope dancing. Whoever can balance on the rope the longest without falling off gets the promotion. When Marlow continues his description of the journey, we penetrated deeper and deeper into the heart of darkness. It was very quiet there. At night, sometimes the roll of drums behind the curtain of trees would run up the river and remain sustained faintly, as if hovering in the air high over our heads till the first break of day. Whether it meant war, peace, or prayer, we could not tell. We were wanderers on a prehistoric earth, on an earth that wore the aspect of an unknown planet. We could have fancied ourselves the first of men taking possession of an accursed inheritance, to be subdued at the cost of profound anguish and of excessive toil. But suddenly, as we struggled round a bend, there would be a glimpse of rush walls, of peaked grass roofs, a burst of yells, a whirl of black limbs, a mass of hands clapping, of feet stamping, of bodies swaying, of eyes rolling under the droop of heavy and motionless foliage. The steamer toiled along slowly on the edge of a black and incomprehensible frenzy. The prehistoric man was cursing us, praying to us, welcoming us. Who could tell? Marlow's thoughts about the humanity, or the lack of humanity, of the natives foreshadow the challenge to civilization's claim to humanity that he will encounter when he meets Mr. Kurtz. He says, "It was unearthly, and the men were, no, they were not inhuman. Well, you know, that was the worst of it, the suspicion of their not being inhuman. It would come slowly to one. They howled and leaped and spun and made horrid faces, but what thrilled you was just the thought of their humanity, like yours, the thought of your remote kinship with this wild and passionate uproar. Ugly, yes, it was ugly enough, but if you were man enough, you would admit to yourself that there was in you just the faintest trace of a response to the terrible frankness of that noise, a dim suspicion of there being a meaning in it which you, so remote from the night of first ages, could comprehend. And why not? The mind of man is capable of anything, because everything is in it, all the past, as well as all the future. What was there after all? Joy, fear, sorrow, devotion, valor, rage, who can tell? But truth stripped of its cloak of time. Let the fool gape and shudder. The man knows and can look on without a wink. The mind of man is capable of anything, Marlow says. That's a typically modern rationalist statement, reminiscent of René Descartes' statement, I think, therefore I am, or something that Hamlet says to his friends Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. There's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Or Milton's Satan from Paradise Lost, who says, the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. Often these kinds of statements express optimism about the power and freedom of humanity. But in Marlow's case here, there's a premonition of the capacity for savagery. About 8 miles below Kurtz's station, the boat is surrounded by a fog so thick that it can't safely continue. When the fog finally lifts, they are attacked by natives shooting arrows and throwing spears. Marlow finally blows the steam whistle, frightening the natives and sending them into retreat. Marlow will later learn that this attack was an attempt by the natives to prevent him from taking Mr. Kurtz away from them. So it seems that Mr. Kurtz has become a kind of a deity to these natives, and we will learn he has embraced their worship and adoration. Marlow breaks the sequence of the narrative here to describe a pamphlet that Kurtz has written, which will later come into Marlow's possession. Kurtz, it seems, has been commissioned by an organization called the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs to write a report for the future guidance of the society. Marlow says, and he had written it too. I've seen it. I've read it. It was eloquent, vibrating with eloquence, but too high-strung, I think. 17 pages of close writing he had found time for. But this must have been before his, let us say, before his nerves went wrong and caused him to preside at certain midnight dances ending with unspeakable rites, which, as far as I reluctantly gathered from what I heard at various times, were offered up to him. Do you understand? To Mr. Kurtz himself. But it was a beautiful piece of writing. The opening paragraph, however, in the light of later information, strikes me now as ominous. He began with the argument that we whites, from the point of development we had arrived at, must necessarily appear to them, savages, in the nature of supernatural beings. We approach them with the might of a deity, and so on, and so on. By the simple exercise of our will, we can exert a power for good practically unbounded, etc. From that point he soared and took me with him. The peroration was magnificent, though difficult to remember, you know. There were no practical hints to interrupt the magic current of phrases, unless a kind of note at the foot of the last page, scrawled evidently much later, in an unsteady hand, may be regarded as the exposition of a method. It was very simple. And at the end of that moving appeal to every altruistic sentiment, it blazed at you, luminous, like a flash of lightning in a serene sky. Exterminate all the brutes. So Marlow gets to Kurtz's inner station, where he finds Kurtz insane, but still in complete control of the natives. Marlow and his crew are in danger. One word from Kurtz, and the natives will kill Marlow and his crew. Nonetheless, Marlow gets Kurtz and the ivory loaded onto the steamer, and they start back downriver. Kurtz dies during that voyage, and Marlow hears his dying words. The horror, the horror. That leaves Marlow with the duty of delivering Kurtz's effects to his fiancée. It's a task that Marlow approaches with trepidation. He says, "She came forward all in black with a pale head floating towards me in the dusk. She was in mourning. It was more than a year since his death. More than a year since the news came. She seemed as though she would remember and mourn forever. You knew him well, she murmured after a moment of mourning silence. Intimacy grows quickly out there, I said. I knew him as well as it is possible for one man to know another. And you admired him, she said. It was impossible to know him and not to admire him, was it? He was a remarkable man, I said unsteadily. Then, before the appealing fixity of her gaze that seemed to watch for more words on my lips, I went on. It was impossible not to love him, she finished eagerly, silencing me into an appalled dumbness. How true, how true. So the fiancé wants to hear Kurtz's last words. She says, forgive me, I have mourned so long in silence. You were with him to the last? I think of his loneliness, nobody near to understand him as I would have understood, perhaps no one to hear. To the very end, I said shakily. I heard his very last words. I stopped in a fright. Repeat them, she murmured in a heartbroken tone. I want something to live with. Marlow says, I was on the point of crying at her. Don't you hear them? The dusk was repeating them in a persistent whisper all around us, in a whisper that seemed to swell menacingly, like the first whisper of a rising wind. The horror. His last word. To live with, she insisted. Don't you understand? I loved him. Marlow says, I pulled myself together and spoke slowly. The last word he pronounced, I said, was your name. So faced with the choice or the responsibility of telling the truth, the horrible truth of Kurtz's behavior in Africa, Marlow can't do it. He can't disappoint this naive, idealistic woman. She believes that Kurtz was the paragon of the civilizing mission. Marlow knows the truth, but he doesn't have the heart to speak the horrible truth to innocence and idealism. With that, I'll conclude this webcast. But, as always, if you have questions or comments, send me an email.